The morning of his father's funeral, Caleb Turner learned something no 13-year-old should ever have to understand. Silence can be louder than screaming. The small wooden church sat at the edge of town, the kind of place where generations had been baptized, married, and buried. Its white paint was chipped and weathered, the bell above the entrance slightly crooked from decades of wind and storms. Caleb stood in the front pew, his feet dangling just above the floor, hands clenched tightly in his lap. His black suit didn't quite fit. It had belonged to his father. That alone made his chest ache. The room smelled of old wood, dust, and lilies. Too many lilies. People filled the pews behind him, murmuring softly, offering quiet condolences that drifted past his ears without sinking in. Words like, "He was a good man," and "I'm so sorry, son," floated around him, hollow and distant, as if spoken underwater. Caleb stared at the closed casket. His father, Mark Turner, had been the kind of man everyone in town knew. Not famous, not wealthy, just dependable. The man who fixed fences without being asked, who helped neighbors haul firewood before winter, who showed up early and stayed late. To Caleb, though, he was more than that. He was everything. Mark had raised him alone after Caleb's mother died when he was still a toddler. There were no memories of her, only a faded photograph and the soft way his father used to say her name. For years, it had been just the two of them in a modest house on the edge of town, living simply but warmly. Then Mark remarried. Her name was Linda. At first, Linda tried, or at least that's what Caleb told himself. She cooked dinners, asked polite questions, smiled when neighbors were around, but there was always a stiffness to her kindness, a careful distance she never quite crossed. Caleb learned early to stay out of the way, to be quiet, helpful, and invisible. After Mark's sudden heart attack, that distance became a wall. The funeral service ended with a short prayer. The pastor's voice trembled slightly as he spoke about God's plan and eternal rest. Caleb didn't listen. He was too busy noticing something else, something that made his stomach tighten. Linda sat 2 rows behind him. She didn't cry. Her face was composed, almost unreadable. While others wiped their eyes and leaned into one another, Linda sat upright, hands folded neatly, eyes forward. She looked relieved. Caleb didn't have the words for that feeling yet, but it settled deep in his chest like a cold stone. After the service, people gathered outside under a pale gray sky. Winter wasn't fully there yet, but it was close enough to feel sharp air, bare branches, the promise of cold days ahead. Neighbors hugged Caleb awkwardly, some pressing folded bills into his hand when they thought Linda wasn't watching. "She'll take care of you," one woman whispered gently. Caleb nodded, even though something inside him knew better. The ride home was quiet. Linda drove. The radio stayed off. The road stretched ahead, familiar but suddenly foreign. Caleb watched the trees blur past, remembering how his father used to hum while driving, tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with whatever song was playing. Linda didn't hum. She didn't speak. When they reached the house, Linda parked and sat for a moment, her hand still on the wheel. The engine idled softly. Caleb waited, unsure of what he was waiting for. Finally, she sighed. "Well," she said flatly, "things are going to change." Caleb's heart skipped. He followed her inside, the house feeling emptier than it ever had before. His father's boots still sat by the door. His jacket hung on the hook, untouched. Caleb swallowed hard. Over the next few days, the changes came quickly. Linda stopped cooking meals for him. She left him lists of chores instead. She spoke less, and when she did, her tone was clipped, impatient. She complained loudly about bills, about how expensive everything had become, about how hard it was to manage on one income. Caleb tried to help. He cleaned. He chopped wood. He offered to get a part-time job, even though he was only 13. He stayed out of sight, out of mind, hoping if he made himself small enough, he wouldn't be a problem. But grief doesn't soften people who were already hard. One evening, a week after the funeral, Caleb came home to find his backpack sitting by the door. Inside were a few clothes, his toothbrush, and the old notebook his father had once given him, the one filled with sketches, notes, and bits of advice about the outdoors. Linda stood in the kitchen, arms crossed. "This isn't working," she said. Caleb froze. "I can't do this," she continued. "I didn't sign up to raise someone else's kid alone. I've done enough." His ears rang. I can help more," Caleb said quickly, his voice thin and shaky. "I won't be any trouble, I promise." Linda shook her head. "You're old enough to figure things out," she replied. Your father always said you were strong. She opened the door. Cold air rushed in. Caleb stood there stunned, his heart pounding, his mind scrambling to catch up with reality. 13 years old. No mother, no father, no home. As he stepped onto the porch, the door closed behind him with a final echoing click. Caleb Turner stood alone, gripping his backpack. The world suddenly vast, unforgiving, and terrifyingly quiet. And somewhere deep inside that frightened boy, something else stirred, a fragile, stubborn spark that refused to go out. Caleb Turner didn't move for a long time after the door closed. He stood on the porch with his backpack hanging from one shoulder, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of his jacket. The house behind him looked exactly the same as it always had. White siding, narrow windows, the porch light buzzing faintly. But it no longer felt like home. It felt like a place he had been erased from. He knocked once. Then again. "Linda?" he called, his voice cracking. There was no answer. Inside, the television flickered on. Laughter spilled through the walls, sharp and careless. Caleb felt something inside him collapse. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, like a bridge giving way, plank by plank. That was when he understood. She wasn't coming back. The sky was already darkening, painted in heavy shades of bruised purple and gray. The air smelled like damp leaves and distant wood smoke. Fall was nearly over, and winter was close enough to feel in his bones. Caleb stepped off the porch. Each step down the driveway felt unreal, like walking away from a dream he didn't remember choosing. He reached the road and stopped, unsure which direction to go. Every path felt wrong. Every option felt terrifying. So he walked. He passed houses where warm lights glowed behind curtains. Families sat down to dinner. Dogs barked. Cars pulled into driveways. Life continued, indifferent and intact. No one noticed the boy walking alone with everything he owned on his back. By the time his legs started to ache, Caleb found himself at the edge of town near the old railroad tracks. The ground was uneven there, scattered with gravel and dead weeds. He sat down on a rotting wooden beam and hugged his knees to his chest. The quiet pressed in. That was when the tears came. Not loud sobs, those felt impossible, but silent, shaking breaths that left his chest burning. He cried for his father, for the house he would never enter again, for the future that had disappeared without warning. Mostly he cried because he was 13 years old and completely alone. When the tears finally slowed, Caleb wiped his face with his sleeve and opened his backpack. He pulled out the old notebook his father had given him years ago. The cover was worn, the edges curled from use. Inside were drawings of trees, rough maps of trails, notes about weather patterns and animal tracks. His father's handwriting. Caleb traced a finger over the words, grounding himself in something familiar, something steady. Mark Turner had always believed in preparation, in paying attention, in understanding the land instead of fighting it. Panic never helps, his father used to say. Think first, then act. Caleb took a shaky breath. Okay. Thinking didn't make him feel safer, but it gave him something to hold on to. He couldn't go back to the house, that much was clear. He had no relatives nearby, no phone, no money to rent a room. Going to the police or child services felt like stepping into a system that would swallow him whole, scatter him into places where he didn't belong. The idea made his chest tighten. So he made a decision. Not a perfect one, not even a smart one, but one that felt possible. He would go where no one else went. Beyond the tracks, past the last row of houses, the land sloped upward into woods most people avoided. Too rocky, too windy, too cold in winter. His father used to hunt deer there, always careful, always respectful. Caleb had gone with him a few times. He knew the trails. He stood up, brushed the dirt from his jeans, and started walking again. The woods swallowed him quickly. Branches clawed at his sleeves. The ground was uneven and slick with fallen leaves. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no voices, just wind through bare branches and the crunch of his boots against the forest floor. Fear followed him, close and constant. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow seemed alive. But beneath the fear, something else began to surface. Focus. The kind his father had taught him. The kind that came from paying attention instead of panicking. He found a small clearing tucked between two rocky outcrops. The wind moved strangely there, splitting and curling instead of cutting straight through. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't brutal either. Caleb stopped. This place felt different. He dropped his backpack and sat down hard, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His hands shook as he wrapped his jacket tighter around himself. He hadn't eaten since morning. His stomach growled, sharp and insistent. "I'll figure it out," he whispered to no one. Night settled fully over the forest. Caleb built a small fire the way his father had shown him. Careful, controlled, respectful. The flames flickered weakly, but they were enough to chase away the worst of the cold. He sat close, staring into the fire until his thoughts slowed. Sleep came in short, broken stretches. Every time he drifted off, a sound pulled him back. Wind, branches snapping, distant animal calls. His body stayed tense, alert, vulnerable. When morning finally arrived, pale and gray, Caleb felt older than he had the day before. His muscles ached, his eyes burned, but he was still there, alive. He stood and stretched, looking around the clearing with new eyes. In daylight, he could see things he'd missed the night before. The way the rocks blocked the strongest wind, the slight slope that would drain water away, the way the sun brushed the ground for a few precious hours each morning. Something stirred inside him. Not hope exactly, but determination. This place wasn't home. Not yet. But it could be a beginning. Caleb Turner tightened the straps on his backpack, lifted his head and took a deep breath. The world had turned its back on him, so he would learn to stand on his own. Morning in the woods came quietly. Caleb Turner woke to the sound of wind moving through bare branches and the dull ache in his shoulders from sleeping on the cold ground. His fire had burned down to ash sometime during the night, leaving behind a faint smell of smoke that clung to his clothes. The clearing looked different in daylight, less frightening, more exposed. He sat up slowly, rubbing his arms for warmth. The forest didn't care that he was tired, or hungry, or 13 years old. It simply existed. Caleb stood and walked the edges of the clearing, forcing himself to notice details the way his father had taught him. The ground sloped gently downward toward the east. Meltwater from snow would drain away instead of pooling. Thick rocks broke the wind from the northwest. Sunlight filtered through the trees in the early morning. Brief but real. "This could work," he murmured. The words felt strange in his mouth, but they steadied him. The first order of business was shelter. Last night's fire had kept him alive, but it wouldn't be enough. Not for weeks, not for the cold he knew was coming. He needed something more reliable, something that didn't disappear with a gust of wind. Caleb gathered fallen branches, stacking them carefully instead of randomly. He leaned them against a low rock wall, creating a rough triangle, then filled the gaps with pine needles, leaves, and smaller sticks. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't strong, but it was better than nothing. Every movement made his stomach twist with hunger. He hadn't eaten since before Linda shut the door. By midday, his hands were numb, his arms scratched raw. When he finally stepped back to look at what he'd built, the structure sagged awkwardly, like it might collapse at any moment. Caleb swallowed hard. "This isn't right," he said quietly. Frustration surged through him, sharp and overwhelming. He kicked a loose rock, sending it skidding across the clearing. His chest tightened, anger mixing with fear. He missed his father. Mark Turner would have known how to do this properly. He would have shown Caleb how to choose better materials, how to brace the frame, how to work smarter instead of harder. For a moment, Caleb considered giving up, walking back toward town, finding someone, anyone, to help him. Then he pictured Linda's face, the door closing, the television laughter. The thought hardened something inside him. No! Caleb pulled his father's notebook from his backpack and flipped through the pages. Rough sketches of lean-tos, notes about wind direction, observations written in careful, slanted handwriting. "Pay attention to what the land wants," his father had written once. "Don't force it." Caleb took a deep breath and looked around again. The land wasn't flat. It wasn't gentle, but it was honest. He spent the rest of the afternoon watching instead of building. He noted how the wind shifted as the sun moved. He marked where shadows fell and where sunlight lingered longest. He followed a faint animal trail that led downhill and found a narrow stream, mostly hidden beneath rocks and brush. Water. That discovery changed everything. Caleb knelt beside the stream, cupping his hands and drinking slowly. The water was cold and clear, real, reliable. He laughed softly, an exhausted, almost disbelieving sound. "Okay," he said, "okay." That night he rebuilt the fire, this time closer to the rock wall. He adjusted his shelter slightly, angling it to block the strongest wind. It still wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable. Sleep came easier. The next few days blurred together in a rhythm of small victories and quiet setbacks. Caleb learned quickly what worked and what didn't. He learned that deadwood snapped cleanly and burned hotter than green branches, that stones absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, that moving deliberately conserved energy. He also learned his limits. Hunger gnawed constantly. His hands stayed cracked and sore. Cold seeped into his bones when the sun disappeared. More than once, he woke in the night shaking uncontrollably, fear curling tight in his chest. Each time he reminded himself of one simple truth. He was still here. By the end of the week, his shelter had improved. He reinforced the walls with thicker branches, stacked rocks at the base for stability, and layered pine needles so thick they muffled the ground beneath him. He found a place to store wood, keeping it dry beneath an overhang of stone. It wasn't home, but it was beginning to feel like something close. One afternoon, as he returned from gathering firewood, Caleb heard voices. His heart jumped into his throat. He froze, every muscle tense, and listened. Two men walked the lower trail, their boots crunching loudly. Their conversation drifted up through the trees. Complaints about the cold, jokes about how winter always came too early. Caleb crouched low, holding his breath. They passed without noticing him. Relief washed over him, followed by a sharp realization. People weren't supposed to be here. That meant if they found him, questions would follow. And questions led to places he didn't want to go. Caleb knew then that survival wasn't just about shelter and fire. It was about staying unseen. He began working earlier in the morning and later in the evening, avoiding the middle of the day. He kept his fire small, the smoke thin. He learned how to move quietly, how to erase signs of his presence. Each choice made him more cautious, more deliberate. Older. As fall deepened, the air grew heavier, colder. Leaves disappeared from the trees. Frost crept across the ground in the mornings, fragile and beautiful. Caleb stood one evening at the edge of his clearing, watching the sky darken. Winter was coming. He wasn't ready, not fully, he knew that. But he was learning, and for the first time since the night Linda shut the door, Caleb Turner didn't feel like a lost child waiting for rescue. He felt like someone preparing to endure, and that made all the difference. The first real cold arrived without warning. Caleb Turner woke one morning to frost crusted over the ground like shattered glass. His breath fogged the air as he sat up, heart pounding, instinctively checking the fire pit. The ashes were cold, too cold. He rubbed his hands together, fighting the sharp sting in his fingers. Winter wasn't coming anymore. It was here. The shelter he had built, careful, layered, improved day by day, had carried him through fall. But now, as the temperature dropped and the wind grew more relentless, Caleb could feel its limits. The cold crept in from every direction, slipping through gaps he hadn't noticed before. That night, even with the fire burning, sleep came in short, restless bursts. He woke shivering, jaw clenched, his body tense with the kind of fear that didn't scream but whispered constantly. This won't be enough, he thought. Not for what's ahead. The realization didn't crush him the way it might have weeks earlier. Instead, it sharpened his focus. Survival had taught him something important. Panic wasted energy. Thought saved it. The next morning, Caleb didn't gather wood. He watched. He spent hours observing the clearing the way he once watched his father study weather patterns. He tracked how the wind curved around the rock outcroppings instead of slamming straight through. He noticed how cold pooled in the certain low spots while higher ground stayed marginally warmer. He traced the path of sunlight across the clearing, noting where it lingered longest. Patterns began to emerge. That night, he pulled out his father's notebook again. Between sketches of shelters and notes about terrain, Caleb found something he'd overlooked before. Simple diagrams, circular shapes drawn again and again in the margins. His father had written a single line beside one of them. Corners fight the wind, curves guide it. Caleb stared at the words, something clicking deep inside him. He thought about his shelter. Angled walls, sharp edges, places where the cold seemed to gather. He thought about the way wind wrapped around the rocks instead of crashing into them, about how animals curled into themselves when they slept. Nature didn't use straight lines. It never had. The idea took hold slowly, cautiously. What if he stopped trying to block the cold? And then started trying to work with it? Caleb began experimenting in small ways. He rearranged stones around the fire pit, forming a rough curve instead of a straight barrier. He noticed the heat lingered longer. He stacked logs in a semicircle behind where he slept, feeling how the wind slipped past instead of pushing directly through. Encouraged, he took a bigger step. Over the next several days, Caleb dismantled part of his shelter and rebuilt it. Not larger, but rounder. He used rocks as a low circular base, stacking them carefully so the weight distributed evenly. On top of that, he layered thick branches, angling them inward, closing gaps with packed earth, pine needles, and mud. It was exhausting work. His muscles screamed, his hands bled. Hunger gnawed at him constantly. More than once, he had to sit down and steady himself as dizziness washed over him. But something about this felt right. The structure began to take shape. Not a house, not yet, but something solid, something intentional. When he finally crawled inside on the third night, he noticed the difference immediately. The wind still howled outside. Inside it softened. The fire warmed the curved walls, and instead of disappearing into the night, the heat seemed to stay, clinging to the space. The temperature didn't plummet the moment the flames died down. Caleb let out a shaky laugh. "I'm not crazy," he whispered to himself. That realization, small but powerful, changed the way he saw everything. He wasn't just surviving by luck. He was learning. As days passed, Caleb refined his design. He thickened the walls. He layered materials the way his father once taught him, dense on the outside, insulating toward the inside. He moved the fire closer to the center, noticing how the warmth spread more evenly. He kept notes in the margins of his father's notebook, adding his own observations in uneven, hurried handwriting. Curved wall holds heat longer. Wind slides instead of pushes, less wood burned. Each improvement brought a quiet satisfaction, not pride exactly, but confidence. The kind that grows slowly, rooted in effort and understanding. One afternoon, while gathering stones near the lower trail, Caleb heard laughter. He froze. Two teenagers from town stood nearby, kicking at the dirt, unaware of him. They talked loudly, careless. "Someone said there's a kid living up here," one of them said, snorting. "Like, actually camping." "No way," the other replied. "He'd freeze. This place is a joke." Caleb stayed hidden, heart racing. The words stung more than he expected. That night, alone in his shelter, the laughter replayed in his head. Doubt crept in, quiet but persistent. What if they were right? What if this was all just a temporary illusion of safety? He pressed his hand against the wall. It was warm. Not hot, not fragile. Warm. Caleb exhaled slowly. "They don't know what I know," he thought. And for the first time, that difference didn't make him feel small. It made him feel strong. The cold deepened as November slid toward December. Snow dusted the ground, light at first, then heavier. The forest transformed, silent, stark, unforgiving. Inside his curved shelter, Caleb adjusted, adapted, endured. He wasn't comfortable, but he was alive. And somewhere between the cold nights and the quiet mornings, Caleb Turner stopped thinking of himself as a boy waiting to be saved. He became someone building a future, one careful curve at a time. December arrived like a challenge no one had agreed to accept. The first heavy snow fell overnight, quiet and relentless. By morning, the forest was buried beneath a thick white blanket, every sound muffled, every shape softened. Caleb Turner woke inside his curved shelter to a strange stillness, the kind that made the world feel paused. He sat up slowly. The air inside was cold, but not biting. His breath didn't fog as thickly as it had in the open shelter weeks before. The stones along the wall felt cool to the touch, not frozen. Caleb frowned. That was new. He stirred the fire pit and coaxed a small flame to life, using far less wood than he would have needed before. The fire caught quickly, warmth spreading through the rounded space like a held breath finally released. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, it softened into a low, distant sound, present but no longer threatening. Caleb pulled his jacket tighter and smiled despite himself. The cold had arrived, and for the first time it hadn't won. The storm didn't stop. Snow fell for 3 straight days, piling high enough to bend young trees and bury the trails Caleb once followed easily. The temperature dropped hard at night, plunging well below freezing. The forest became an unforgiving place, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Caleb adapted. He learned when to stay inside and when to move. He rationed wood carefully, burning small fires at the right times instead of desperate ones all night long. He packed snow around the base of his shelter, discovering that it acted as insulation rather than an enemy. Each lesson came with effort. Each mistake came with consequence. One night, the fire died earlier than expected. Caleb woke shivering, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Panic surged. but only for a moment. He forced himself to breathe, relit the fire, and adjusted the airflow the way he'd practiced. By morning, he was exhausted but alive. That mattered. A mile downhill, the town struggled. Caleb didn't know the details at first, only the signs. Smoke rising constantly from chimneys. Wood piles shrinking faster than expected. The distant echo of chainsaws as people cut whatever they could to keep warm. One afternoon, while gathering branches near the lower trail, Caleb heard voices again. This time, he didn't hide right away. Two men stood nearby, older, bundled in heavy coats, frustration sharp in their voices. "Burned through half my supply already," one complained, "and it's not even Christmas." "Same," the other replied. "House still won't hold heat. Corners leak like crazy." They laughed bitterly. Caleb stayed still, heart pounding. Not with fear this time, but something else. Recognition. The men moved on without seeing him, but their words lingered. That night, Caleb sat inside his shelter, listening to the wind and watching the fire glow low and steady. He wasn't warm like he was in summer, but he wasn't desperate, and that difference mattered more than he realized. Word traveled the way it always did in small towns. Slowly at first, then all at once. Someone spotted smoke rising from the ridge and wondered who was foolish enough to camp up there in winter. Someone else remembered rumors about a kid living in the woods. A third added details that weren't true. Wild guesses shaped by boredom and cold. By mid-December, people were talking. Caleb noticed the change before he ever saw anyone. Boot prints appeared near the lower trail. Fresh ones. Larger. Careless. One morning, he found a crushed branch where none had been before. He didn't like it. The forest had kept him hidden because no one expected survival up here. Now, curiosity was replacing certainty. One afternoon, Caleb heard laughter drifting through the trees, closer than before. He crouched low and watched as three figures came into view near the edge of the clearing. Teenagers. High school kids. Faces he vaguely recognized from town. "Dude, this is insane," one said, stomping his boots. "People said there was actually someone living up here." Another laughed. "Probably just some idiot freezing his butt off." Caleb stayed hidden, heart pounding hard enough to hurt. They wandered closer. Then one of them stopped. "Hey, look." Caleb braced himself. They'd spotted the shelter. The boys stared at it, confusion replacing amusement. Snow had piled around it, but the structure held firm. No sagging, no obvious collapse. Smoke rose in a thin, steady line from the fire vent. "That doesn't look awful," one admitted. "Yeah," another muttered. "Still dumb, though." They laughed again, louder this time, as if mocking the shelter would restore the confidence they'd lost. Caleb waited until they left before moving. The encounter left him shaken, not because of what they said, but because of what they'd seen. He realized then that survival had entered a new phase. It wasn't just about staying warm or fed anymore. It was about standing by what he'd built when others doubted it. That night, the cold deepened. The wind slammed harder than it had all season, rattling branches and sending snow swirling in blinding sheets. Caleb lay inside his shelter, eyes open, counting his breaths. The storm tested every decision he'd made. Snow drifted against the walls, but instead of pressing in, it settled, forming a dense protective layer. The curved shape guided the wind around the structure, not through it. Inside, the air stayed surprisingly stable. Caleb adjusted the fire once. That was all. As the storm raged on, a realization crept in. Quiet, but undeniable. This wasn't luck. This wasn't stubbornness. This was understanding. By morning, the forest was buried beneath fresh snow, transformed and silent. Caleb stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. His shelter stood, unbroken, unbowed. He exhaled slowly, a feeling swelling in his chest. Something like pride, but steadier. Earned. Down in town, people would wake to frozen pipes and empty wood stacks. They would curse the cold and wonder how much worse it might get. Up on the ridge, a 13-year-old boy stood beside a curved shelter he'd built with his own hands. The wind sliding past him like it had learned a lesson. The cold had started taking sides, and for the first time it wasn't on theirs. By January, the winter stopped pretending to be fair. The cold no longer came in waves. It settled in and refused to leave. Night after night, temperatures dropped to levels people in town would talk about for decades. Wind cut through the valley like a blade, stripping heat from anything foolish enough to stand in its path. Caleb Turner felt it too, but he felt it differently. Inside his curved shelter, the cold pressed from the outside like a distant threat rather than an immediate danger. The walls held their warmth stubbornly, stones releasing heat long after the fire dimmed. Caleb burned less wood now than he had in early December, even as the nights grew longer and harsher. He noticed everything. The way the fire's warmth moved evenly through the space instead of pooling in one corner. The way frost formed outside but never crept across the interior walls. The way his breath slowed, steadied, even when the storm screamed outside. He started keeping records, not out of pride but instinct. Temperature at dusk, temperature before dawn, amount of wood burned. His father would have approved. Down in town, things were unraveling. Caleb didn't see it firsthand, but the forest carried echoes, chainsaws whining day and night, the acrid smell of desperation in the smoke that rose constantly from chimneys. Wood piles vanished. People who'd always been prepared found themselves burning furniture, fence posts, anything they could spare. One morning, Caleb heard shouting from far below. The sound carried strangely through the cold air, sharp, urgent, afraid. Later that same day, he spotted movement on the lower trail. A man struggled uphill, boots sinking deep into the snow. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a walking stick, breath ragged in the frozen air. Caleb froze, instinct screaming at him to hide. But something else held him in place. Concern. The man reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, staring. At the shelter, at the smoke rising gently from the vent, at the boy standing there, alert but calm. "Well, I'll be damned," the man muttered. Caleb's heart hammered. The man introduced himself as Frank Lawson, a farmer from the far end of town. His face was weathered, lined deeply by years of hard work, and now by exhaustion. "I heard rumors," Frank said, voice hoarse. "Didn't believe 'em. Thought maybe you were already frozen solid." Caleb swallowed. "I'm okay." Frank laughed weakly, shaking his head. "That's more than most of us can say right now." Against every instinct to stay hidden, Caleb stepped aside. "You can warm up," he said quietly, "just for a minute." Frank hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The change hit him instantly. He stopped dead, eyes widening. The warmth wasn't overwhelming. It didn't blast him the way overheated rooms sometimes did. Instead, it wrapped around him evenly, deep and steady, like the kind of heat that reached your bones. Frank exhaled a shaky breath. "Good Lord," he whispered. "How is it warmer in here than my house?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to explain it yet. Frank looked around, taking in the curved walls, the central fire, the way everything felt intentional. "You out here alone?" he asked. Caleb nodded. Frank ran a hand over his face. "We've been burning twice the wood we usually do. Still can't keep the house above 50 at night. My wife's sick. Pipes froze yesterday." Silence settled between them. Not awkward. Heavy. Before leaving, Frank studied the shelter one last time. "Mind if I tell folks what I saw?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. The next visit came 3 days later. Then another. Men came first, curious, skeptical, desperate. They didn't laugh when they saw the shelter. They didn't joke when they stepped inside. They asked questions instead. Caleb answered them carefully, explaining what he could, how the walls worked, why the shape mattered, why he burned less wood instead of more. He showed them his notes, his measurements, his records. Facts spoke louder than arguments ever could. One man, a broad-shouldered logger with frostbitten hands, stood quietly for a long time before speaking. "We've been doing it wrong," he said finally. The words landed hard, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. One afternoon, as the sky darkened early under heavy clouds, a familiar figure appeared on the trail. Caleb recognized her immediately. Linda. She stood at the edge of the clearing, bundled in a heavy coat, her face pale and strained. She looked smaller than Caleb remembered, less certain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I heard," she said finally, voice tight, "about this." Caleb didn't respond. The wind moved between them, cold and unforgiving. "You look well," she added. Caleb studied her, searching for something, remorse, warmth, recognition. He found fear instead. "I'm surviving," he said. The simplicity of the words surprised them both. Linda shifted uncomfortably. "The house, it's been hard," she admitted. "Cold like this, it's dangerous." Caleb nodded. He knew. She glanced at the shelter, then back at him. "I didn't think you'd make it." The honesty stung, but it also clarified something. "I did," Caleb replied quietly. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again. There were no excuses left that mattered. She left soon after, footprints filling with snow almost immediately. Caleb watched until she disappeared. He didn't feel triumph. He felt closure beginning to form. That night, the cold reached its worst. Temperatures plunged far below anything December had thrown at them. Wind battered the ridge, relentless and cruel. Snow slammed against the shelter, testing every curve, every decision. Inside, Caleb lay awake, listening. The shelter held. The fire burned low and steady. The walls stayed warm. As the storm raged, Caleb Turner understood something profound. Not just about survival, but about truth. Nature didn't care who was young or old, who was mocked or believed, who followed tradition or dared to question it. Nature responded only to understanding. And in the middle of the worst winter anyone could remember, a 13-year-old boy stood proven, not by words but by endurance. The storm passed by morning. The truth did not, and the town would never see him the same way again. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came cautiously, like it wasn't sure it was welcome after the winter it had followed. Snow retreated in patches, stubborn and slow. Ice loosened its grip on the creek. The forest began to breathe again. Caleb Turner noticed the changes the way he always had, quietly, carefully, with attention earned through hardship. He stood outside his shelter one morning, watching sunlight spill across the clearing. The air was still cold, but it no longer felt hostile. For the first time in months, he wasn't bracing himself for the next storm. He exhaled. He had made it. Not because someone rescued him, not because winter was kind, but because he learned how to endure. The shelter stood behind him, unchanged and unbroken. Its curved walls bore the marks of snow and wind, evidence of battles survived rather than damage suffered. To anyone else, it might have looked small, temporary, unimportant. To Caleb, it was proof. The town changed too. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come with apologies or speeches. People simply started showing up differently. Men from the valley climbed the ridge not out of curiosity anymore, but respect. They brought questions instead of jokes, notebooks instead of doubt. How did you keep the heat in? Why doesn't the wind tear it apart? How much wood do you really burn? Caleb answered honestly. He explained what he understood and admitted what he didn't. He showed them the walls, the fire placement, the way the curve guided the wind instead of fighting it. He shared his notes, his mistakes, his small discoveries. He didn't brag. He didn't need to. The truth was standing right in front of them. By late March, two men started building shelters of their own. Not copies, but adaptations. Different sizes, different materials. Same principle. Curves instead of corners. Understanding instead of habit. Caleb watched from a distance, something warm settling in his chest. What he'd built was bigger than a place to sleep. It was a lesson. Linda never came back. She didn't ask Caleb to return, and he didn't expect her to. The winter had stripped excuses down to their bones, and what remained couldn't be repaired with words. Caleb didn't carry anger about it anymore. Some people didn't know how to stay. That wasn't his burden to fix. One afternoon, Frank Lawson climbed the ridge again, this time with a folded piece of paper in his pocket. He handed it to Caleb carefully, like it mattered. It was a letter. Inside was an offer. Simple, straightforward. A place to stay if Caleb wanted it. Help with school, no pressure. Caleb read it twice. Then he looked around the clearing. At the shelter, at the trees, at the place that had held him when nothing else would. "I'm not ready to leave," he said gently. Frank nodded. "Figured you might say that." They shook hands, quiet understanding passing between them. That summer, Caleb expanded the shelter, not outward, but inward. He improved the walls, strengthened the roof, refined the design. He planted a small garden in a sunlit patch of soil nearby, learning through trial and error what would grow and what wouldn't. Life became something steady, not easy, but honest. Sometimes at night, Caleb sat by the fire and thought about the boy he'd been the day the door closed behind him. The frightened 13-year-old gripping a backpack, unsure if the world had any place left for him. He wished he could tell that boy something. That fear didn't mean failure. That being alone didn't mean being weak. That survival wasn't about fighting harder, but understanding deeper. The winter had taken many things from many people, but it had given Caleb something rare. Confidence earned the hard way. Years later, people would talk about that winter like it was a story passed down, about the storms, the cold, the houses that nearly failed, and the boy on the ridge who didn't. They would talk about how strange it was that a child, abandoned and overlooked, figured out something adults had missed for generations. Caleb never corrected them. He knew the truth was simpler. He had listened to the land, to experience, to lessons others ignored, and the land had answered. So here's the question for you. How many things in your own life have you accepted as the only way simply because that's how everyone else does them? What might change if you stopped fighting the wind and learned how to move with it instead? Caleb Turner didn't survive because he was stronger than winter. He survived because he understood it. And sometimes that understanding is what turns a place of abandonment into a place of becoming. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or question something you thought you already knew, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about resilience, quiet courage, and ordinary people who endured extraordinary moments. Because sometimes the strongest shelters aren't built from walls and roofs. They're built from understanding, patience, and the refusal to give up when the world turns cold.